It's 4 p.m. here in Seoul. Thank you for tuning in to our afternoon newscast. I'm Devin Whiting. We start with John Bolton, who's now wrapped his series of meetings with South Korean officials. The U.S. National Security Advisor met with his South Korean counterparts here in Seoul, as well as the nation's defense chief and foreign minister. Our presidential correspondent Shin Se-min is on the line with the latest. Se-min, things are coming to a head in the trade conflict with Japan. Is there any sign from these meetings that the U.S. might intervene on South Korea's behalf?
Devin, not quite. John Bolton wrapped up his series of meetings with South Korean officials today and was due to leave for Washington right around now at 4 p.m. Now, he met with his South Korean security counterparts, the defense chief, and the top diplomat here, discussing a number of issues concerning the allies. But unlike many had anticipated, Bolton's meeting did not revolve much around Japan's trade restrictions on South Korea, but it did cover the peace process on the Korean peninsula. Now, when Bolton met with the defense minister, the two did mention the need for security cooperation between Korea, Washington and Japan, and they promised to continue close consultations on upgrading their three-way cooperation moving forward. But no specific mention, at least based on the press release, however, of whether or not Washington will step in between Seoul and Tokyo over the ongoing trade route. But the bottom line of maintaining a close cooperation between South Korea and the U.S., no change there. Here's John Bolton before he went into the meeting with South Korea's foreign minister.
So there are many challenges out there, some in this part of the world, some in other parts of the world, but I'm confident that ROK and U.S. will work very closely together to resolve them.
Now, Se-min, I understand they also discussed the violations yesterday of South Korea's airspace by Russia and the flights by China. Tell us more.
Right. When Bolton sat down behind closed doors with the South Korean National Security Advisor Chung Eui-yong, they discussed the unprecedented violation of Korean airspace by Russia and the entering of Korea's air defense identification zone by both Russian and Chinese military aircraft. The two had agreed to continue close consultation when such emergencies happen. And in a readout released by the presidential spokesperson, South Korea's security chief explained how Russian and Chinese military planes had entered the Korean Air Defense Identification Zone, known as KADI's, early Tuesday morning. And both Chung and Bolton also discussed how to cooperate on the U.S.-driven efforts to ensure free navigation in the waters off Iran. The presidential spokesperson added that the two sides also talked about the defense cost sharing of the two countries, to which they agreed to seek consultations based on the spirit of bilateral ties in the most reasonable and fair way. Devin?
All right, Se-min, thank you for the updates there. Shin Se-min from the presidential office. And now North Korea has recently shown what's being called a negative response to plans to send it 50,000 tons of rice aid from South Korea, citing Seoul's upcoming joint military drill with the U.S. It's not clear what form that negative response took, but according to Seoul's Unification Ministry, the North expressed its view to the World Food Program at a recent working-level meeting, and Seoul learned of it through its consultations with the WFP. However, Seoul says the North has not yet announced a final decision, and the WFP is looking to clarify the North's position. The South Korean government says it still hopes to deliver the rice as soon as possible. The Seoul Metropolitan Government is designating a quarry from the 17th century as part of the city's cultural heritage. The quarry was found around 3 years ago and contains an inscription showing that the stone from it was used to build one of the Joseon dynasty's royal tombs. It's the only such quarry to have been so specifically identified. It's located in the northern part of Seoul on Bukhansan Mountain, where the inscription says its stone was not to be used without permission. Today is the last day Japan is accepting feedback before it decides whether to take South Korea off its white list of trading partners. To prevent that, Seoul's Trade Ministry submitted an opinion to Tokyo on Wednesday, urging it to withdraw the curbs. Yoon Jung-min reports.
South Korea's Trade Ministry submitted an opinion to Japan on Wednesday, again urging Tokyo to take back its export curbs and not to exclude South Korea from the 27 countries on its so-called white list who received preferential treatment on trade.
Japan should immediately retract its groundless export restrictions on the 3 items related to semiconductors. Also, Japan should withdraw its move to revise the trade law to take South Korea off its whitelist. Companies and people in both countries do not want to break South Korea and Japan's win-win economic ties, which have lasted more than 60 years, because of this issue.
Removal would mean Japanese exporters have to apply for approval to ship goods to South Korea on a case-by-case basis. The ministry added that it hopes to maintain a future-oriented relationship with Tokyo and is fully ready to talk. The government refuted Japan's claims one by one. It said South Korea has always properly managed its own controls on exports to North Korea based on a catch-all system involving relevant government institutions and experts, a system it said is stricter than Japan's. Furthermore, Japan's argument is false, it said, because it fails to understand South Korea's tight system of control over strategic and non-strategic goods. It went on to say that Seoul has kept its dialogue channels with Tokyo open. Japan had cited a lack of communication as another reason for the curbs, but last year, the 7th high-level talks between Seoul and Tokyo were postponed with the agreement of both sides because Japan also understood it was not easy for them to adjust the schedule. The Trade Ministry also said Japan's latest moves go against the WTO's principles of free trade and are short-sighted because they will hurt Japanese companies and the global supply chain. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
Discussions at the WTO of Japan's export curbs were supposed to happen on Tuesday, but they were pushed back by other items on the agenda. It's now expected to come up on Wednesday, and South Korea's representatives are ready to make their case. Kim Yo-sun reports.
Discussions at the WTO General Council on Japan's trade restrictions on South Korea have been pushed to Wednesday due to time constraints. It was listed as the 11th agenda among the 17 items set for Tuesday's meeting. But the meeting went longer than expected, with the Council agreeing to meet again Wednesday to discuss the remaining agenda items. While the meeting lasted nearly 6 hours, excluding the recess, the member states only managed to discuss up to item number 8. During the annual meeting of the International Trade Watchdog's top decision-making body, aside from the ministerial conferences, many developing countries raised their voices on the effectiveness of WTO's aid programs. Seoul's Deputy Trade Minister Kim Seung-ho, who is leading Seoul's delegation, was not fazed by the delay.
I will stand there with the same attitude to explain our stance.
While Kim was expected to confront Shingo Yamagami, Director General of the Japanese Foreign Ministry's Economic Affairs Bureau, during the meeting, Yamagami only showed up as the meeting was wrapping up. The Japanese ambassador to Geneva, Junichi Ihara, was present for most of the meeting.
We will listen to South Korea's opinions as it requested the issue to be dealt with as an agenda item, and then explain our stance courteously and clearly.
Yamagami also explained Tokyo's measures to not go against the WTO's spirit of free trade. With Seoul and Tokyo certain to clash over Japan's trade restrictions, it's left to be seen whose side the international community will take in the increasingly bitter fight. Kim Yo-sun, Arirang News.
Members of South Korea's parliament are also working to resolve the Japan trade conflict. On Wednesday, a delegation of lawmakers left for the U.S. for talks with American officials. And next week, another group will head to Japan. Kim Mo-gyun reports.
A parliamentary delegation led by former National Assembly Speaker Chung Se-kyun of the ruling Democratic Party is visiting Washington for 5 days until Sunday. The 7-member team will meet with senators from the upper and lower house, as well as high-ranking State Department officials, to explain that Japan's export restrictions against South Korea are unjust. The delegation will also deliver a unanimous resolution adopted by Foreign Affairs and Unification Committee lawmakers earlier this week, which mainly calls for Japan to withdraw the curbs. Alongside the delegation to the U.S., another group of lawmakers led by independent lawmakers Ho Chung-won is set to visit Japan for 2 days beginning July 31st. Though the other participants are yet to be confirmed, the delegation is expected to meet with Japanese counterparts to argue for the withdrawal of Japan's export curbs against Korea, as well as discuss ways to mend the worsening ties between the two countries. Ahead of the visits, National Assembly Speaker Moon Hee-sang sent letters to his U.S. and Japanese counterparts on Tuesday, stating his concerns about Tokyo's export restrictions. In his letter to the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, Moon expressed hopes for Washington to mediate in the row, and in his letter to Japan's House of Representatives Speaker Tadamori Oshima, Moon called for Japan to refrain from taking additional measures and work to resolve the issue diplomatically. Kim Mo-gyun, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, a senior South Korean trade official is in Washington looking to win American support on the issue. Arriving Tuesday, Trade Minister Yoo Myung-hee told reporters that she will highlight that Japan's moves hurt the international economy as well as South Korea. She also stressed that the price of semiconductor components, especially DRAM chips, have jumped 23% in just 2 weeks, which she said could have big repercussions for the global economy. She's expected to meet with U.S. economic and trade leaders before departing later this week. And Japan's export curbs have sparked a massive boycott of Japanese products in South Korea. As we've reported this week, many South Koreans have canceled their travel plans to Japan, but that's having the knock-on effect of harming South Korea's aviation industry. Lee Min-sun reports.
The boycott of Japanese products in South Korea has accelerated ever since the trade spat between the two countries blew up earlier this month. More and more South Koreans are canceling pre-booked trips to Japan and are encouraging others to do the same online. A local branch of Korea's National Agricultural Cooperative Federation even ran a special campaign giving away 10 kilograms of rice to those who called off their trip to Japan. With the swelling number of cancellations, South Korea's low-cost carriers are either canceling or slashing the number of routes or the regularity of their flights to Japanese cities. Starting September, Air Busan, a subsidiary of Asiana Airlines, will discontinue its daily route from Korea's southern city of Daegu to Tokyo's Narita Airport and cut in half its flights between Daegu and Osaka. EasterJet will also scrap routes to 2 Japanese cities from Busan in September. Jin Air and T-Way Air have made similar decisions. Many existing air routes to Japanese cities run by the low-cost carriers weren't that popular in the first place and weren't bringing in substantial profits. With the boycott, airlines are adjusting their routes and are seeking to diversify their international destinations.
Demand for Japanese routes has been decreasing since the turn of the year. The trade dispute just accelerated the reorganization of routes to Japan.
Japan's major tourist hubs are also feeling the heat. Tsushima Island, located about halfway between the Korean peninsula and Japan, used to be a popular tourist destination for South Koreans. Some 600,000 Koreans visited the island last year by ferry, but stores that were once packed with tourists now sit empty and the street deserted. The impact is already being felt less than a month into the boycott, and if it continues to expand and intensify, there's no guessing the effect it will have on both countries' economies. Lee Min-sun, Arirang News.
It's time now for an in-depth look at the market action on this Wednesday, and for that I'm joined on the line by Dr. Hwang Se-eun, Research Fellow at the Korea Capital Market Institute. Dr. Hwang, thank you for coming on today.
Nice to be with you today.
So Wall Street closed higher overnight, apparently on anticipation for the U.S.-China trade talks resuming next week. The Dow up about 0.2% and the Nasdaq not far behind. What's happening there and in the Korean markets?
In Wall Street, stocks ended higher Tuesday on news that face-to-face talks between U.S. and Chinese trade negotiators will begin next week. A batch of stronger than expected earnings also lifted the market sentiment. Stocks extended gains late in the session after the press reported that U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer would travel to Shanghai next week for face-to-face trade meetings with Chinese officials. In addition to this, the U.S. corporate earnings season is off to a strong start, with nearly 80% of 104 S&P 500 companies topping earnings expectations so far in the second quarter. Asian shares showed mixed price movement on Wednesday amid hints of progress in Sino-U.S. trade talks. Not so welcome as was news the U.S. Justice Department was opening an antitrust investigation of major digital tech firms and possible anti-competitive practices. Japan's Nikkei added 0.41%, while South Korea's Kospi lost 0.91% as of close.
Well, as we just heard, at the WTO's general meeting, they're discussing Japan's trade curbs on Korea. Japan, of course, arguing that it's not imposing new restrictions, but merely going back to business as usual. What do you see coming out of this meeting?
The highest decision-making body of the WTO will be reviewing Japan's trade restriction following a formal complaint from Seoul, which earlier sought a similar move by the WTO Council for Trade in Goods. Japan's export restrictions on 3 industrial materials appear to violate the rules of the WTO, and the move is politically motivated retaliation for South Korean court ruling on wartime forced labor. South Korea is appealing that it would be an unjust and groundless measure to have Korea removed from Japan's list of preferential trade partners without providing any concrete example of a case where such controls were inadequate. South Korea's appeal is likely to be supported by WTO because Japan's export restrictions are apparently political retaliation. However, Korean companies could suffer from sizable damages for a long time until the final decision is made.
Now, meanwhile, the IMF has lowered its growth forecast for the global economy this year from 3.2% to 3.3 to 3.2. Why the downgrade?
The International Monetary Fund further reduced its global growth outlook, already the lowest since the global financial crisis in year 2008, and suggested that policy missteps on trade could derail a projected rebound. The world economy will expand 3.2% this year and 3.5% next year, both down 0.1 percentage point from April projections. A rate of 3.3 or lower would be the weakest since year 2009. The slowdown in growth and downgrade in the forecast reflect the ongoing fallout from trade tensions. Since the IMF's last round of forecasts in April, 3 more months of data have confirmed weaker growth in much of the world, while tariffs escalated between the U.S. and China during a 2-month breakdown in negotiations. Global trade has decelerated rapidly during the ongoing trade tensions. Dynamism in the global economy is being weighed down by prolonged policy uncertainty as trade tensions remain heightened despite the recent U.S.-China trade truce.
All right, Dr. Huang, lots to watch right now. Thanks for an interesting discussion.
Thank you very much.
Now, the South Korean government has announced that it will allow 7 regions of the country to test innovative technologies without strict regulations. President Moon says to make Korea competitive in the 4th Industrial Revolution, it's essential to innovate in terms of regulation to create the environment local firms need to keep their business in the country. Our Park Hee-jun reports.
President Moon Jae-in says regulatory innovation is a matter of survival in the 4th Industrial Revolution. He underlined the importance of creating an environment that encourages the fastest development and use of new technology to make South Korea the world's most innovative economy. The president was speaking at a gathering of governors and top officials from across the country in the southern port city of Busan on Wednesday. The government announced the same day a new plan that frees 7 regions from regulations. These areas will be exempt from 58 regulations and will be able to test their innovative technologies without regulation for 2 years. These areas include Busan, focusing on blockchain technology, and Sejong City, focusing on automated driving technology. South Korea is the first country in the world to take such measures. President Moon explained that the steps are necessary to prevent domestic firms from moving their businesses overseas due to strict regulations. He called on regional governments to support the global launch of products and services based on those technologies. Also pointing to the effects that the U.S.-China trade war and Japan's export regulations are having on Korea's major industries, President Moon emphasized that all regions need to pull together. The president also reiterated the importance of strengthening local firms' competitiveness in high-tech materials and diversifying imports. It's not an easy path for sure, but he made it clear that it's the path that must be taken in the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Park Hee-jun, Arirang News.
The IMF has cut its forecast for global growth this year and the next. The key reasons, it seems, are the U.S.-China trade war as well as uncertainties over Brexit. Lee Seung-jae reports.
In its latest World Economic Outlook report Tuesday, the IMF cut its forecast for global growth in 2019 and 2020, sending a warning that the U.S.-China tariff spat and Brexit could lead to a further slowdown, weakened investment, and a disruption to global supply chains. According to the IMF, downside risks have intensified, and it now expects global growth to be 3.2% this year and 3.5% next year, a decrease of 0.1 percentage point for both years from its previous forecast in April. The IMF's latest downgrade is the fourth cut since October. The global lender says economic data so far this year and softening inflation point to weaker than expected activity, with trade and technology tensions adding to the bleak forecast. The IMF also slashed its forecast for global trade growth by 0.9 percentage point to 2.5% for this year, but said trade growth should rebound to 3.7% in 2020. But that's still 0.2 percentage point under its previous forecast. However, the IMF paints a rosier picture for advanced economies such as the United States. The IMF raised its forecast for the U.S. to 2.6% in 2019, but left its 2020 forecast unchanged at 1.9%. The IMF also upgraded its global forecast for the Eurozone to 1.6% in 2020, leaving its 2019 outlook unchanged at 1.3%. The IMF urged countries to work at the multilateral level to reduce trade tensions, also calling for efforts to ensure the continued enforcement of existing World Trade Organization rules. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
The U.S. and China will resume their trade talks next week. According to Bloomberg, a delegation headed by Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer will be in China next Monday through Wednesday for high-level talks in Shanghai, a venue of Beijing's choosing. The talks will be the first face-to-face negotiations between the two sides since their previous talks collapsed in May. The U.S. and China have been reportedly speaking by phone since last month when the two leaders directed their negotiators to resume talks. But U.S. officials have played down the likelihood of a quick deal. What's old is new again, as they say, and the younger generation in Korea apparently have a fondness for the fashion and culture of a century ago. The trend is called Newtro, as our Kim Hae-sung reports.
A combination of the words new and retro, Newtro refers to a new interpretation of retro culture. Newtro is growing in popularity across the retail industry, with those in their teens and 20s spreading Newtro-related goods or experiences on Instagram. In Uljiro in downtown Seoul, there are more than a dozen boutique shops that sell dresses, suits, and other clothes and accessories from the late 19th to early 20th century, or the so-called Enlightenment period in Korea.
The first shop opened late last year thanks to the popularity of Korean dramas like Mr. Sunshine that showcased 90s culture. The dresses became popular among women in their 20s, and it has continued this year. The number of boutique shops is continuing to grow as demand from people in their 30s and 40s is also rising.
Old buildings in Uljiro have been renovated into restaurants and stores, combining modern facilities and products with traditional interior design. This cafe is decorated in the style of the 1900s, and the wooden tables, ceilings, teapots, and mirrors look traditional.
I like how it's traditional tea, but it's served in these iced glasses. It's interesting. We've heard of the 1900s lifestyle, but I've never experienced it myself. I was always curious about it, and it's nice to try something like this.
Newtro is a new interpretation of the past. It triggers nostalgia from the older generation and weighs on curiosity who wants something new, hip from the younger generation. For businesses, products are flooding the market and there's a limit to new content, so this Newtro really hits the demand.
This Newtro trend has also hit the food and beverage industry and even the global game industry, with Nintendo and Tencent coming up with retro games like Super Mario Bros. Seizing the interest of both the older and younger generation, experts say the Newtro trend will likely continue to evolve and last for some time. 김혜성, 아리랑 뉴스.
And that brings us to the end of this newscast. More live news coming your way at 7 p.m. Korea time.